Picture this. You're sitting in the front pew of your church, the same spot you've occupied every Sunday for 8 years, watching your husband of 12 years walk down the aisle with another woman on his arm. Not just any woman, his 28-year-old coworker who he's been telling you is just a mentee. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The same woman he swore was nothing more than a professional contact when you questioned those late-night texts. The same woman who is now wearing a dress eerily similar to the one you wore on your wedding day, holding your husband's arm like she belongs there, smiling at the congregation like she's already taken your place. That was my reality 3 months ago. My name is Rebecca Thompson, and I thought I knew my husband David better than anyone. I thought our marriage was solid, our faith unshakable, and our future secure. I was wrong about all three. But what happened next changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought they could treat a woman's heart like a disposable commodity. The morning it all unraveled started like every other Sunday in the Thompson household. I woke up at 6:30 as I had for the past 8 years, to prepare for our family's church routine. The coffee was brewing, the kids' church clothes were laid out, and I had already ironed David's favorite blue shirt, the one that brought out his eyes and made him look distinguished when he stood up to read scripture during service. David had been reading scripture more frequently lately, something that filled me with pride. Pastor Coleman had been giving him bigger roles in the church, and I thought it meant our spiritual life was deepening. I remember feeling grateful that morning, standing in our kitchen in Riverside, Ohio, watching the sunrise through our window that overlooked Maple Heights subdivision. We had built a good life here. David's job at Pinnacle Industries provided well for our family. My part-time position at Sterling Marketing Group gave me purpose beyond motherhood, and our children, Emma and Tyler, were thriving in the church youth program. Emma, our 10-year-old, was getting ready for her solo in the children's choir. She had been practicing Amazing Grace for weeks, her sweet voice filling our house with hymns every evening after homework. Tyler, 8 and always the comedian, was excited because it was Communion Sunday, which meant he got to sit with the adults instead of going to children's church. These were the moments that made me believe we were exactly where God wanted us to be. David had been different lately, though I couldn't quite put my finger on how. He was more attentive in some ways, bringing me flowers randomly, suggesting date nights, even helping with dishes without being asked. But there was also a distance, a distraction that seemed to pull him away even when he was sitting right next to me. When I mentioned it to my sister Nicole during our weekly phone calls, she laughed and said all marriages go through phases. When I brought it up to my best friend Lisa at church, she reminded me that David had been under a lot of pressure at work with the new regional expansion project. The project, that's what he called it when he had to work late, when he traveled to Columbus for meetings, when his phone buzzed during family dinners. Amanda Walsh was part of that project team. I had met her exactly twice, once at the company Christmas party where she seemed sweet and eager, calling me Miss Thompson and complimenting my dress, and once when she stopped by our house to drop off some files when David was sick with the flu. Both times she seemed nervous around me, barely making eye contact, speaking in a soft voice that made her seem younger than her 28 years. David always spoke highly of Amanda's work ethic. "She's really going places," he would say. "Reminds me of myself when I started at Pinnacle." He had taken her under his wing, he explained, because she reminded him of his younger sister who had died in a car accident 10 years earlier. It was touching, really, how much he cared about mentoring the younger employees. It was one of the things I loved about my husband, his generous heart, his willingness to help others succeed. That Sunday morning I was running slightly behind schedule because Tyler couldn't find his church shoes and Emma had decided her hair wasn't quite right and needed to be completely redone. David was already dressed and waiting by the car, checking his phone and looking impatient. This wasn't unusual. He had always been punctual to a fault, a trait that served him well in business, but sometimes left the rest of us feeling rushed. "Come on, Becca," he called through the front door. "Pastor Coleman is reading the announcements about the missions trip today, and I promised I'd be there early to help set up the presentation materials." The missions trip, David had been talking about it for months, a 2-week journey to Guatemala to help build a church and school. He was passionate about it in a way I hadn't seen him passionate about anything in years. He had already started learning basic Spanish, had researched the area extensively, and had even convinced his boss at Pinnacle Industries to sponsor some of the building material. I was proud of his dedication, even though it meant he would be gone during Emma's birthday month. We finally made it to the car, our silver Honda Pilot that had served our family well for 5 years. Emma was practicing her solo under her breath in the back seat while Tyler was explaining in elaborate detail why he thought communion crackers should be chocolate chip cookies instead. I was mentally running through the potluck lunch menu, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything for the green bean casserole I had promised to bring. Grace Community Church sat on a hill overlooking downtown Riverside, its white steeple visible from almost anywhere in town. We had chosen this church when we moved to Ohio because of Pastor Coleman's sermons about practical faith, how to live Christian lives in the modern world without compromising your value. The congregation was large enough to offer excellent programs for the kids, but small enough that everyone knew everyone. It was the kind of place where people brought casseroles when you were sick, where the men organized work days to help elderly members with yard work, where the women's Bible study felt more like family than friendship. David parked in his usual spot, 3rd row from the front, driver's side. He had claimed this spot on our very first Sunday and had been parking there ever since. It was close enough to show commitment, but not so close as to seem showy. Everything about David was measured like that, calculated to make the right impression while still being genuine. As we walked up the steps to the church, I noticed David checking his phone again. This had become more frequent lately, the constant phone checking, but I attributed it to work stress. The regional expansion project had deadlines, and David was the kind of man who took his responsibilities seriously. It was one of the qualities that had attracted me to him 12 years ago when we met at a business conference in Cincinnati. He was ambitious but not ruthless, driven but not selfish. At least that's what I thought. We settled into our usual pew, 3rd row from the front, right side. Pastor Coleman always said he could count on seeing the Thompson family in that spot every Sunday, and it had become a source of pride for me. Consistency in faith, consistency in life. Emma went to join the children's choir and Tyler sat between David and me, swinging his legs and trying to read the hymn numbers upside down. The service began as it always did, with Mrs. Henderson at the piano playing the opening hymn. The congregation rose and I felt that familiar sense of peace that came with Sunday mornings, the feeling that all was right with the world, that our family was exactly where we belonged. David's rich baritone voice harmonized with mine as we sang, "How Great Thou Art," and I remember thinking how blessed I was to have a husband who wasn't embarrassed to sing loudly in church. But then something shifted. During the second verse I noticed David's attention wasn't on the hymnal we were sharing. His eyes were focused somewhere behind me, and there was an expression on his face I couldn't quite read. It wasn't the peaceful concentration he usually wore during worship. It was something else. Something that made my stomach tighten with an unidentifiable unease. When we sat down for the announcements, David immediately pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. I assumed it was a work emergency. It was always a work emergency. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw it wasn't an email. It was a text message, and while I couldn't read the content, I could see it was part of a long conversation with someone named Amanda Walsh. I felt a small flutter of concern but pushed it away. David mentored Amanda, and if there was a work crisis on Sunday morning, it made sense that she might reach out to him. Still, something about the urgency of his typing, the way he angled the phone away from me, made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't articulate. Pastor Coleman was talking about the upcoming church picnic, about the youth group car wash fundraiser, about the new members class starting next Wednesday. Normal church business, the comfortable rhythm of community life. But I wasn't really listening anymore. I was watching David's profile, noticing the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth as he read something on his phone, noticing how he seemed more engaged with whatever was happening on that screen than with anything happening around him. Then Pastor Coleman said something that made my blood run cold. Before we continue with today's service, I want to recognize some special guests who are joining us this morning. We have several visitors, including a young woman who works with one of our own members. David Thompson, would you like to introduce your colleague? I turned to look at David, expecting to see the same confusion I felt. Who was this colleague? When had David arranged for someone from work to visit our church? But David wasn't confused at all. In fact, he was already standing up, that charming smile he used in business meetings spreading across his face. "Thank you, Pastor Coleman," David said, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary. "I'd like you all to meet Amanda Wall. She's new to the Riverside area and was looking for a church home. I told her there was no better place than Grace Community." My head snapped around to scan the congregation, and there she was, 3 pews back, sitting alone but somehow looking perfectly comfortable, wearing a navy blue dress with white trim that was so similar to one hanging in my own closet that it took my breath away. Amanda Walsh, the sweet young woman from David's office, the mentee he was helping develop professionally, was sitting in our church like she belonged there. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way she was looking at my husband. Not with the respectful admiration of a junior colleague, not with the grateful appreciation of someone receiving career guidance. She was looking at David the way I used to look at him during our early dating years, with adoration, with longing, with the kind of intimate familiarity that spoke of shared secrets and private moments. And David was looking back at her the exact same way. The congregation was offering polite applause, welcoming this new visitor as we always did. Pastor Coleman was saying something about the importance of bringing friends to church, about how faith grows when it's shared. Mrs. Henderson was already preparing the next hymn. Everything was proceeding normally, just another Sunday morning in the life of Grace Community Church. But I felt like I was drowning, sitting in the front pew of my own church, surrounded by people I had worshipped with for 8 years, listening to my husband's voice as he talked about this woman who worked for him. I felt like I was sinking into a reality I didn't recognize and couldn't escape. David sat back down next to me, and I could feel the satisfaction radiating from him. He was pleased with himself, proud even. He reached over and squeezed my hand, the same gesture he had made thousands of times over our 12 years of marriage. But now it felt different. It felt like an act, a performance for the benefit of the watching congregation. I tried to focus on Pastor Coleman's sermon, something about Jesus calling the disciples, about answering when faith calls you to step out of your comfort zone. But all I could think about was Amanda Walsh, sitting 3 rows behind us. All I could think about was the way my husband had said her name like it was precious to him. All I could think about was how perfectly she seemed to fit into this space that had been ours for so long. When we stood for the closing hymn, I turned slightly ostensibly to share the hymnal with Tyler, but really to get another look at Amanda. She was singing along. She knew the words to Blessed Assurance, which meant this wasn't her first time in a church, possibly not even her first time in this church. She caught me looking and offered a small, almost apologetic smile that somehow made everything worse. After the service, during the meet and greet time when everyone mingled in the fellowship hall, I watched David guide Amanda through the crowd like he was showing off something valuable. He introduced her to Pastor Coleman's wife, to the elderly Wilsons who ran the church's charity drives, to Lisa Martinez, who had been my closest friend in the congregation for 6 years. Everyone was charmed by her. She was polite, well-spoken, appropriately dressed, everything you would want in a new church member. But I saw things others didn't see. I saw the way she touched David's arm when she laughed at his joke. I saw the way she positioned herself just slightly closer to him than professional courtesy required. I saw the way she deflected questions about her personal life, while somehow making everyone feel like she had answered them completely. Most of all, I saw the way my husband transformed in her presence, becoming more animated, more charming, more like the man I had fallen in love with 12 years ago. Emma found me during the coffee hour, tugging on my dress with excitement. "Mommy, did you hear my solo? Did I do good?" I looked down at my daughter's eager face and realized I had been so distracted by Amanda's presence that I had barely heard Emma's beautiful rendition of Amazing Grace, the song she had practiced so diligently, the moment she had been looking forward to for weeks. "You were wonderful, sweetheart," I managed, pulling her into a hug that was as much for my comfort as hers. "I'm so proud of you." But even as I held my daughter, even as I tried to focus on her achievement and her joy, I couldn't stop watching David and Amanda across the fellowship hall. They were standing near the coffee station, heads bent together in conversation that looked far too intimate for a Sunday morning in church. Whatever they were discussing, it was making Amanda laugh in a way that lit up her entire face, and David was leaning in like he didn't want to miss a single word. Lisa Martinez appeared at my elbow, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the expression she got when she was about to share gossip. "That young woman seems nice," she said, nodding toward Amanda. "David says she's new to town. It's sweet that he's helping her find a church home." "Yes," I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself. "She's very pretty," Lisa continued, and there was something in her tone that made me look at her sharply. Lisa had been married for 18 years, had raised 3 teenagers, and had developed the kind of intuition about people that comes from experience. How old did David say she was?" 28, I replied automatically, then immediately wondered why I even knew that detail. Lisa nodded slowly, sipping her coffee. 28. That's a big age gap for a professional mentorship, isn't it? I mean, David's what, 45? 45, I confirmed, and suddenly that 17-year age difference seemed enormous, significant in a way I hadn't considered before. We stood in silence for a moment, both watching David and Amanda. They had moved to the bulletin board where the missions trip information was posted, and David was pointing out details about Guatemala, his hand resting casually on Amanda's lower back in a gesture that would have looked protective and friendly to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. But I was looking carefully now, and what I saw made my chest tighten with something I wasn't ready to name. Tyler appeared at my other side, chocolate from the fellowship hall brownies smeared on his cheek. "Mom, can we go home now? I want to play with my new Lego." "In a minute, buddy," I said, still watching my husband and his colleague. Amanda was asking David something, her face turned up toward his with an expression of complete attention. David was answering her, gesturing toward the Guatemala photos, but his eyes weren't on the picture. They were on her face, studying her reactions, pleased by her interest. It was the way he used to look at me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. David was looking at Amanda Walsh the way he used to look at me in the early days of our relationship, when every conversation felt important, when every shared interest felt like a miracle of compatibility. I hadn't seen that expression on his face in years, not when I told him about promotions at work, not when I suggested romantic weekend getaways, not even when I had surprised him with tickets to see his favorite band for his birthday last month. "Becca?" Lisa was looking at me with concern. "Are you okay? You look a little pale." "I'm fine," I said automatically, the words every woman uses when she's anything but fine. "Just tired. It's been a long week, but I wasn't fine." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Standing in the fellowship hall of Grace Community Church, surrounded by people I had worshipped with for 8 years, watching my husband with a woman who was supposed to be just his colleague, I felt like I was waking up from a dream I didn't realize I had been having. A dream where my marriage was solid, where my husband's late nights and distracted phone calls and sudden interest in mentoring were all perfectly innocent, where the life I had built was exactly what it appeared to be. Amanda was saying goodbye now, shaking hands with Pastor Coleman, hugging Mrs. Wilson, thanking David for inviting her. When she turned to leave, she caught my eye across the fellowship hall and walked over to where I stood with Lisa and Tyler. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "It was so nice to see you again. Thank you for sharing your church with me. It's exactly what I was looking for." Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, her voice warm and sincere. Up close, she was even prettier than I had realized, the kind of natural beauty that didn't require much makeup, with clear skin and bright eyes, and the energy that comes with being 28 and full of possibility. She was also wearing perfume, something light and floral that reminded me of the expensive department store samples I used to collect, but never buy. "You're welcome," I managed. "I hope you'll visit again." "Oh, I definitely will," Amanda said, and there was something in the way she said it, a certainty, a sense of ownership, that made me feel like she was talking about more than just church attendance. After she left, After we had packed up our children and our casserole dish and our church bags, after we had driven home in our silver Honda Pilot, with Emma humming her solo and Tyler chattering about the missions trip, I found myself standing in our kitchen, feeling like a stranger in my own life. David was in his usual post-church routine, changing into casual clothes, checking work emails, getting ready to spend the afternoon working in his home office on reports and presentations. But something was different. There was an energy about him, a lightness that I hadn't seen in months. He was humming under his breath, the same hymn we had sung in church, and when he kissed my cheek on his way to the office, there was genuine affection in the gesture. The problem was, I was beginning to suspect that affection wasn't for me. The week following Amanda's church visit passed in a blur of ordinary moments that felt anything but ordinary. David's behavior shifted in ways so subtle that I questioned whether I was imagining things. He started taking longer showers in the morning, spending extra time selecting his clothes, and using a cologne I didn't recognize. When I asked him about it, he mentioned that Amanda had complimented the scent at a work meeting, and he thought it was more professional than his usual aftershave. "She has good taste," he said, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "Young people today really understand business presentation better than our generation did." I watched him from our bed, where I was folding laundry, his shirts, my blouses, Emma's school uniforms, Tyler's play clothes. The domestic routine that had once felt comfortable now felt suffocating. "Since when do you care what 28-year-old colleagues think about your cologne?" David paused in his grooming, meeting my eyes in the mirror. "Becca, don't start. Amanda is part of the leadership development program. Her feedback matters for my career advancement. Mr. Hayes specifically asked me to mentor her because he sees potential in both of us." The way he said her name, Amanda, with such careful pronunciation, such obvious fondness, made something cold settle in my stomach. But I swallowed the feeling and focused on matching Tyler's soccer socks. Marriage counselors always said not to make mountains out of molehills, and I wasn't the type of woman who created drama where none existed. Except the drama was creating itself. On Tuesday evening, David announced he would be working late again. The regional expansion project required detailed market analysis, he explained, and Amanda had volunteered to stay and help him crunch numbers. "She's incredibly dedicated," he said, loosening his tie as he spoke. "Reminds me of myself when I was starting out at Pinnacle." "Will you be home for dinner?" I asked, stirring the pasta sauce I had started for our family meal. "Better not wait for me. This could take until 8 or 9 o'clock. Emma, who had been setting the table, looked up with disappointment. "But Daddy, you promised to help me with my science project tonight." David's face flickered with what might have been guilt, but he quickly knelt down to Emma's level. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. How about this weekend? We'll make it extra special." It was the same promise he had been making for weeks. The science project remained unfinished, sitting on Emma's desk like a monument to good intentions that never materialized into action. But Emma nodded eagerly, trusting in the way only children can trust, believing that this time would be different. After David left for his late work session, I found myself washing dishes with unusual vigor, scrubbing plates that were already clean, organizing cabinets that didn't need organizing. Lisa called around 8:30, her voice bright with the kind of gossip that usually entertained me. "You'll never guess what happened at the church board meeting tonight," she said. "Pastor Coleman announced that we're getting a new volunteer coordinator for the missions trip. Apparently, David suggested someone from his office who has experience with international development projects." My hands went still in the soapy water. "Did he mention a name?" "Amanda, something, Walsh? A young woman who visited last Sunday." Pastor Coleman seemed impressed with her credentials. I set down the dish I was holding very carefully. "Amanda Walsh. That's it. David really spoke highly of her, said she would bring fresh perspective to the missions plan. It's wonderful how he's always thinking about ways to strengthen our church community." After I hung up the phone, I stood in my kitchen feeling like the walls were slowly closing in. David hadn't mentioned anything about Amanda volunteering for the missions trip. He hadn't mentioned anything about her having international development experience. Most importantly, He hadn't mentioned anything about suggesting her for a church leadership position. These were the kinds of details married couples shared with each other. These were the kinds of decisions that affected family life, church involvement, and community relationships. The fact that David was making these choices without discussing them with me felt like a betrayal of its own kind, not romantic infidelity, but a systematic exclusion from his decision-making process. Thursday brought a different kind of revelation. I was at Sterling Marketing Group, working on a campaign for a local restaurant chain, when Jenny Kim knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Becca, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't be offended," she said, closing the door behind her. Jenny and I had worked together for 3 years, and she wasn't typically one for dramatic statements. "What's wrong?" I asked, minimizing the spreadsheet on my computer screen to give her my full attention. "I was at the Riverside Mall yesterday, having lunch at that new sandwich place near the food court. I saw David there with a young woman. They were sitting very close together holding hands across the table, and she was wearing what looked like an engagement ring." The words hit me like ice water. "You must have been mistaken. David was at work yesterday afternoon." Jenny sat down across from my desk, her expression compassionate, but firm. "Becca, I know David pretty well from all the company parties and church events. It was definitely him." And the woman matched the description of that girl who visited church on Sunday. Blonde hair, navy blue dress, very young looking. They were holding hands. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else. More than that, she was feeding him bites of her dessert. They looked like they were celebrating something. When they got up to leave, he had his arm around her waist, and she was leaning into him like. Jenny trailed off, clearly not wanting to finish the sentence. "Like what?" "Like they were in love." I stared at Jenny for a long moment, processing this information that confirmed what my instincts had been whispering for weeks. David and Amanda weren't just colleagues. They weren't just mentor and mentee. They were involved in a way that made public displays of affection feel natural, comfortable, routine. "Jenny, are you absolutely certain it was them?" "I took a picture," she said quietly, pulling out her phone. "I'm sorry, Becca, but I thought you should know." The photograph showed David and Amanda sitting in a restaurant booth, her left hand extended across the table so he could examine something on her finger. Her face was radiant with joy. His was tender with an intimacy I recognized, but hadn't seen directed at me in years. They looked like a couple celebrating an engagement, planning a future, sharing a secret that made them glow with happiness. I studied the image for details that might prove Jenny wrong. Perhaps it was someone who resembled Dave. Perhaps the young woman was a relative, a niece, celebrating a promotion or graduation. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation for the hand-holding, the ring examination, the obvious affection between them. But even as I searched for alternative explanations, I knew the truth. This was my husband, with another woman, acting like a man in love, behaving in ways he hadn't behaved with me in years. The engagement ring, Jenny had noticed, wasn't Amanda's. It was one David was considering buying for her. My marriage was over, and I was apparently the last person to know. That evening, David came home with flowers, a dozen red roses that must have cost $40, far more than he typically spent on romantic gesture. He presented them with the kind of flourish he used to reserve for anniversaries and birthdays, kissing my cheek with enthusiasm that felt performative, rather than genuine. "What's the occasion?" I asked, accepting the roses and trying to keep my voice level. "Can't a man buy flowers for his beautiful wife without needing an occasion?" he replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was overcompensating for something. "I just realized how hard you work to keep our family running smoothly. You deserve appreciation." The roses were beautiful, perfectly arranged, clearly expensive. They were also the kind of flowers you buy when you're feeling guilty about something, when you need to create a distraction from uncomfortable truths, when you're trying to maintain an image that's becoming harder to sustain. I arranged them in our best vase and placed them on the dining room table, where they looked elegant and romantic and completely wrong for the conversation I needed to have with my husband, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I needed more information, more evidence, more certainty, before I confronted David with accusations that would change everything between us. The weekend brought new opportunities for observation. David announced that he would be playing golf on Saturday morning, with clients from work including Amanda, who apparently was an excellent golfer, and could help close some important deal. This was the first time I had heard about Amanda's golfing skills, just as it was the first time I had heard about her international development experience. "Since when does Amanda play golf?" I asked, buttering toast for Emma's breakfast while trying to sound casually interested rather than suspicious. "She played in college," David said, not looking up from his phone where he was presumably checking the weather forecast. "Full scholarship apparently. She's got quite an athletic background." Another detail about Amanda's life that David knew and I didn't. Another piece of information that suggested conversations far more personal than typical workplace interaction. I wondered what other details about Amanda Walsh my husband was storing in his memory, what other aspects of her personality and history he found fascinating enough to remember and share. "Will spouses be joining this golf outing?" I asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "No, it's strictly business. Besides, Amanda isn't married." The way he said it, "Amanda isn't married," with what sounded almost like satisfaction, made my stomach clench. It wasn't just that she was available, it was that David seemed pleased by her availability, like it was a factor he had considered and found favorable. Saturday afternoon, while David was supposedly playing golf, I took Emma and Tyler to Lakeside Park for a picnic. It was something we used to do as a family before David became so consumed with work projects and professional development. The kids were delighted to have my undivided attention, and I was grateful for the distraction of their laughter and game. We were feeding ducks by the pond when Emma asked a question that stopped me cold. "Mommy, why does Daddy smell different?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "He used to smell like Daddy, but now he smells like flowers, and yesterday when he hugged me, his shirt smelled like a lady." Children notice things adults try to ignore. Emma had detected what I had been trying not to acknowledge, that David was coming home with traces of another woman's presence on his clothes, in his hair, embedded in the fabric of his professional shirts that I dutifully laundered every week. "People change their perfume sometimes," I said, which was true but not the whole truth. "Maybe Daddy is trying something new." Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation, but I wasn't. The floral scent that clung to David's clothes wasn't his cologne, it was Amanda's perfume. The same light, expensive fragrance I had detected when she shook my hand at church. David was spending enough time close to Amanda that her scent was transferring to his clothing, which meant they were sharing more than business lunches and professional meetings. That evening, I did something I had never done in 12 years of marriage. I went through David's pockets while he was in the shower. In his pants pocket, I found a receipt from the restaurant where Jenny had seen them together. The purchase was for 2 meals, 2 desserts, and a bottle of champagne, hardly the kind of lunch you share with a junior colleague. The date stamp confirmed it was from the day Jenny had taken the photograph, and the total amount was more than David and I typically spent on anniversary dinner. In his jacket pocket, I found something that made my hand shake, a small velvet jewelry box, empty but clearly recently used. The inside was imprinted with the name of an expensive jewelry store in downtown Columbus, the kind of place where engagement rings started at 3 months' salary. I sat on our bed, holding the empty box and trying to breathe normally. David had bought Amanda Walsh an engagement ring. He had taken her to an expensive restaurant to present it to her. He had asked her to marry him while still married to me, while still living in our house, while still pretending to be the devoted family man that our church community believed him to be. The sound of the shower stopping made me quickly return everything to its original location. I was sitting at our bedroom dresser pretending to apply lotion to my hands when David emerged from the bathroom wearing the terry cloth robe I had given him for Christmas 2 years ago. "How is golf?" I asked, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Great," he said, but he was focused on his phone again, typing rapidly. We're really making progress on the expansion project. Did Amanda play well? She's naturally gifted, he said, and there was pride in his voice that had nothing to do with business development. Some people just have talent that can't be taught. I watched him get dressed for our Saturday evening at home, casual jeans, a polo shirt, the kind of relaxed weekend clothing that used to signal quality family time. But even as he dressed for domestic life, his attention was elsewhere. His phone buzzing with messages that made him smile in ways I hadn't seen in months. "Who keeps texting you?" I asked, trying to sound curious rather than accusatory. "Work stuff," he said automatically, but he was typing back eagerly, his fingers moving across the screen with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for conversations you don't want to end. Later that evening, after we had put the children to bed, after we had watched a movie neither of us really paid attention to, after David had checked his phone approximately 40 times, I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling and facing the truth I had been avoiding for weeks. My husband was having an affair. Not just a physical affair, but an emotional one that had progressed to the point of engagement rings and public declarations of love. He was planning a future with Amanda Walsh while maintaining the facade of our marriage, using our church community and professional relationships to facilitate their relationship, and lying to me with such practiced ease that I questioned my own perception. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, I felt something unexpected: relief. The distance I had been sensing, the distraction I had been noticing, the subtle changes in David's behavior, none of it was in my imagination. I wasn't being paranoid or insecure or overly sensitive. I was being betrayed, systematically and deliberately, by the man I had trusted with my heart, my future, and my children's security. But relief was quickly replaced by rage. Not the hot, explosive anger that leads to screaming arguments and thrown objects, but the cold, calculating fury that comes from realizing you've been played for a fool. David thought he was clever, maintaining two relationships simultaneously, keeping his wife satisfied with flowers and false affection while planning a future with his young lover. He had underestimated me completely. Sunday morning arrived with the cruel irony of another perfect autumn day in Riverside, Ohio. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, the air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Grace Community Church was preparing for another celebration of faith and community. David was humming in the shower, clearly anticipating something that had nothing to do with worship service. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a dress that made me feel confident and strong rather than simply appropriate for church. If I was going to confront the truth about my marriage, I wanted to look like a woman who couldn't be dismissed or underestimated. I wanted to look like someone who demanded answers and deserved better treatment. As we drove to church, David humming, the children chattering in the back seat, the familiar route through our subdivision toward the white steeple on the hill, I felt like I was approaching a battlefield rather than a sanctuary, because I knew Amanda would be there. I knew she would be wearing her engagement ring, glowing with the secret she and David shared, playing the role of the innocent church visitor, while planning to steal another woman's life. But this Sunday would be different. This Sunday, I was going to stop being the oblivious wife and start being a woman who fought for what was hers. Grace Community Church looked exactly the same that Sunday morning, but everything felt different when you knew you were walking into a den of deception. The white columns stood as pristine as ever, the stained glass windows caught the morning light in familiar patterns, and the congregation was gathering with the same warm fellowship that had drawn our family here 8 years ago. But I was no longer the trusting wife who found comfort in routine and tradition. I was a woman on a mission to expose the truth. Amanda was already there when we arrived, sitting in the same pew she had occupied the previous week. But this time she wasn't alone. She had positioned herself next to Margaret and Tom Wilson, the elderly couple who served as unofficial church grandparents to anyone who needed extra family. They were clearly charmed by her attention, and she was playing the role of sweet young woman seeking spiritual guidance with Academy Award-worthy performance. What caught my attention immediately was her left hand. Even from across the sanctuary, I could see the glint of something new on her ring finger. Not the engagement ring David had apparently given her. That would have been too obvious for a public church setting. But a simple gold band on her right hand, that looks suspiciously like a promise ring. The kind of ring a man gives a woman when he's committed but can't yet make their relationship public. David guided our family to our usual pew, but his eyes swept the sanctuary until they found Amanda. When their gazes met, she smiled with the kind of radiant joy that comes from sharing a secret that makes you feel special. David's response was subtle but unmistakable. A slight nod, a softening of his expression, the kind of intimate communication that passes between lovers who must pretend to be strangers. Emma slipped her hand into mine as we sat down. "Mommy, that lady is here again. The one Daddy brought to church." "Yes, sweetheart. Her name is Amanda. She's very pretty," Emma said with the honest observation that comes naturally to children. "She looks like the princess in my storybook." The comparison stung because it was accurate. Amanda did look like a fairy tale princess, young, beautiful, glowing with happiness and possibility. She represented everything I had been 20 years ago, everything I could never be again. But fairy tales usually involve stealing something that belongs to someone else, and I was beginning to understand that I was the one being robbed. Pastor Coleman began the service with announcements about upcoming church events, including detailed information about the Guatemala missions trip. As he spoke about the importance of serving others and spreading Christian love to communities in need, I watched David's face transform with anticipation. This wasn't just about church service for him, this was about 2 weeks in Guatemala with Amanda, away from family obligations and community oversight, free to explore their relationship without the constraints of Riverside, Ohio. "We're blessed to have several new volunteers joining our missions team this year," Pastor Coleman continued. "Amanda Walsh has graciously offered to coordinate our educational supply donations, bringing valuable experience from her work with international development programs." I turned to look at David, expecting to see some acknowledgement that he had failed to mention this significant detail about Amanda's background, but he was staring straight ahead, his expression carefully neutral, like a man who had practiced this moment and knew exactly how to react when his wife discovered information he should have shared weeks ago. After the service, during the fellowship hour, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of standing politely by David's side while he introduced Amanda to more church members, instead of smiling graciously while she charmed our friends and neighbors, I was going to have a conversation with Amanda Walsh myself. I approached her near the coffee station, where she was examining the missions trip photo displays with what appeared to be genuine interest. Up close, she was even more beautiful than I had realized, with the kind of natural elegance that made expensive clothes look effortless and casual makeup appear professionally applied. "Amanda," I said, extending my hand with a smile that felt like broken glass in my mouth. "I don't think we've had a proper chance to talk. I'm Rebecca Thompson, David's wife." Her handshake was firm, her smile bright, but there was something in her eyes that reminded me of a deer caught in headlights. "Mrs. Thompson, it's so wonderful to see you again. Thank you for making me feel so welcome here. Of course, David speaks about you constantly. He's very impressed with your work on the regional expansion project. He's an amazing mentor," she said, and the way her voice softened when she said his name confirmed everything I suspect. "I've learned so much from him about business strategy and professional development, and apparently about international development work as well." Pastor Coleman mentioned your experience with educational programs abroad. For the first time, Amanda's composure flickered slightly. "Oh, I did some volunteer work in college. Nothing as ambitious as what your church is planning." It was a lie, delivered smoothly but still recognizable as deception. Amanda had claimed expertise she didn't possess to justify her involvement in the missions trip, which meant David had helped her fabricate credentials to spend 2 weeks with him in Guatemala. They weren't just having an affair, they were conspiring to use our church's charitable mission as cover for their romantic getaway. "How fortunate that David recognized your qualifications," I said, keeping my voice pleasant while my rage built like pressure in a tea kettle. "He has such good instincts about people. He's very perceptive," Amanda agreed, and again there was that softness in her voice, that intimate tone people use when they're talking about someone they love. "Amanda, may I ask you something personal?" She nodded, though I could see tension creeping into her shoulders. "Are you in a relationship?" It must be difficult being new to Riverside without family or close friends nearby. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Amanda's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, something that might have been guilt, and finally a kind of defiant honesty that told me everything I needed to know. "I'm not in a relationship exactly," she said carefully, "but I am close to someone who means a great deal to me, someone who's helped me understand what real love feels like." "How wonderful. Is he someone from work?" "Yes," she said, and her smile became radiant in a way that made my chest feel tight. "Someone I respect enormously, someone who makes me want to be a better person." I nodded as if I found this romantic development delightful rather than devastating. "And does this someone feel the same way about you?" "I believe so," Amanda said, touching the gold band on her right hand in a gesture that was unconscious but telling. "In fact, I think we're moving towards something very serious. Engagement, perhaps." The word hit her like a physical blow. Her face went pale, then flushed red, and she took a step backward as if I had threatened her instead of simply asking a question. "Mrs. Thompson, Rebecca, please, we're practically family, aren't we? After all, you're working so closely with my husband, joining our church, volunteering for missions trips. It seems like you're becoming quite involved in our lives." Amanda stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to determine exactly how much I knew, and how dangerous this conversation had become. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more careful. "David is a wonderful man. You're very lucky to be married to him." "Yes, I am lucky. 12 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children, a lovely home, a strong faith community. David and I have built something really special together." "I'm sure you have," Amanda said, but there was something in her tone that suggested she didn't consider my marriage an obstacle to her plan. "Of course, marriage requires constant effort, doesn't it? Trust, communication, shared values. David and I have always been very honest with each other about everything: work, relationships, friendships, our hopes for the future. Transparency is so important in a strong marriage." Amanda's composure was cracking now. She understood that I was no longer making polite conversation, but delivering a warning. The question was whether she would heed that warning or escalate the conflict. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you might be misunderstanding the nature of my relationship with David. We work together professionally, and he's been kind enough to help me find a church community. That's all." "Is it?" I asked, and my voice carried an edge I couldn't hide anymore. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like considerably more than professional courtesy." Before Amanda could respond, David appeared at my elbow with the kind of protective instinct that confirmed every suspicion I harbored. "Becca, there you are. I've been looking for you." His eyes moved quickly between Amanda and me, assessing the tension in our conversation. "I see you've been getting to know Amanda better." "Yes, we've been having a fascinating discussion about relationships, and marriage, and the importance of honesty," I said, meeting his gaze direct. "Amanda was just telling me about someone special in her life." David's face went through the same rapid succession of expressions I had seen on Amanda's: surprise, alarm, calculation. But he recovered more quickly, falling back on the charm and deflection that had served him well in business, and apparently in adultery. "Amanda's personal life is her own business, of course, but I'm glad she's finding happiness in Riverside. It's a wonderful community for building lasting relationships." "Indeed it is," I said. "Some relationships last decades. Others, of course, are more temporary." The three of us stood there in the Fellowship Hall of Grace Community Church, surrounded by families enjoying coffee and conversation, children running between tables, elderly couples sharing newspapers and discussing sermon application. Normal church life continuing around us while we engaged in a psychological warfare that would determine the future of my marriage. Pastor Coleman's voice broke the tension. "David, Amanda, I was hoping to catch you both. Could you spare a few minutes to discuss the missions trip logistics?" David's relief was visible. "Of course, Pastor. Becca, will just be a few minutes." As I watched my husband walk away with his lover, and our spiritual leader, discussing plans for a charitable mission that would serve as cover for their affair, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The last vestiges of denial, the final hopes for innocent explanations, the desperate desire to believe in the marriage I thought I had. All of it crystallized into cold, clear understanding. David and Amanda weren't just having an affair. They were using our church, our friends, our shared faith community to facilitate their relationship. They were turning the place where I brought my children to learn about honesty and integrity into a stage for their elaborate deception. They were making a mockery of everything I held sacred, while expecting me to smile and play the role of the oblivious wife. I walked home from church that day with a decision burning in my chest like swallowed fire. If David wanted to use our community connections to advance his affair, then I would use those same connections to expose it. If he thought his professional reputation would protect him from consequences, then I would show him exactly how much damage a betrayed wife could do to a career built on trust and integrity. But first, I needed evidence that would be impossible to deny or explain away. Monday morning brought new resolve and a plan that would have terrified the woman I had been just weeks ago. I called in sick to Sterling Marketing Group, the first time I had used personal leave for anything other than genuine illness or family emergency. Instead of going to work, I drove to downtown Columbus with a specific destination in mind. Pinnacle Industries occupied 3 floors of a glass office building that had always impressed me when I visited for company parties or holiday celebrations. David was proud of working for such a respected firm. Proud of his corner office with views of the Scioto River. Proud of his reputation as one of their most reliable regional managers. That reputation was about to become a liability rather than an asset. I didn't go inside the building. Instead, I positioned myself in the parking garage with a clear view of the employee entrance and settled in to wait. If David and Amanda were as involved as I suspected, their professional interactions would extend beyond normal business hours and appropriate workplace boundaries. I didn't have to wait long. At 11:30 in the morning, when both of them should have been in separate meetings according to the work schedules David shared with me, they emerged from the building together. David's hand was on Amanda's lower back in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate, guiding her toward his car with the kind of protective attention he used to show me when we were dating. They drove to a small restaurant on the outskirts of Columbus, the kind of place that catered to business lunches, but was far enough from Pinnacle Industries that they were unlikely to encounter coworkers. I followed at a distance that allowed observation without detection, parking where I could see them through the restaurant's large front windows. What I witnessed over the next hour was a masterclass in workplace affair management. They sat across from each other in a booth, but their conversation was animated, intimate, punctuated by laughter and gestures that spoke of shared jokes and private understanding. Amanda was wearing a conservative business suit that was appropriate for office wear, but she had styled her hair differently, softer, more romantic, and was wearing makeup that emphasized her youth and beauty rather than her professional competence. David was more attentive to Amanda during that lunch than he had been to me during our last anniversary dinner. He leaned forward when she spoke, touched her hand when making points, gazed at her with the kind of focused attention that made her glow with happiness. When she excused herself to visit the restroom, he watched her walk away with an expression of such obvious desire that I felt embarrassed for witnessing it. But the most damaging evidence came when they prepared to leave. David helped Amanda with her coat, a gesture that extended into an embrace that lasted several seconds too long for professional appropriateness. When they separated, she reached up to adjust his tie, her fingers lingering on his chest in a motion that was purely domestic, purely intimate, purely the kind of thing a woman does for the man she loves. They returned to Pinnacle Industries in David's car, but they didn't go directly to the employee entrance. Instead, David parked in a secluded section of the garage where they sat talking for another 15 minutes. From my vantage point, I could see them clearly through the car windows, David's hand cupping Amanda's face, her hand resting on his thigh, both of them leaning toward each other with the magnetic pull of lovers who didn't want to separate. When they finally kissed, it wasn't the quick, careful kiss of people worried about being discovered. It was deep, passionate, unhurried, the kiss of people who had moved far beyond professional boundaries into territory that belonged exclusively to committed romantic relationships. I took pictures of everything. The photography was easier than I had expected, thanks to the smartphone technology that put professional quality cameras in everyone's pocket. The restaurant scene, the intimate conversation, the extended embrace, the passionate kiss in the parking garage, all of it was documented with clarity that would make denial impossible. But photographs weren't enough. I needed documentation that would connect their personal relationship to their professional responsibilities, evidence that would demonstrate how their affair was affecting David's job performance and potentially creating liability issues for Pinnacle Industries. That evening, while David was supposedly working late again, I took a different approach to evidence gathering. I drove to Amanda's apartment complex, a modern development that catered to young professionals and featured amenities like fitness centers and rooftop terraces. The kind of place where a 28-year-old with a good salary might live while building her career and planning her future. David's car was in the visitor parking area. I sat in my own car, watching the lighted windows of what I assumed was Amanda's apartment, seeing shadows moving behind curtains that suggested domestic intimacy rather than business consultation. At 9:15, David emerged from the building, but he wasn't alone. Amanda walked him to his car, wearing casual clothes that suggested he had been there for hours, not minutes. Their goodbye included another extended embrace, and what appeared to be a conversation about future plans. When David arrived home at 9:45, he had his story ready. "Sorry I'm so late, honey. The market analysis took longer than expected, and then Amanda and I grabbed a quick dinner to discuss the Guatemala trip logistics. You know how these international projects require detailed coordination." He delivered the lie with such practiced ease that I almost admired his skill. If I hadn't spent the day documenting his actual activities, if I hadn't seen him embrace another woman with the passion he used to reserve for me, I might have believed him completely. Instead, I smiled and asked about his day, listened to his fabricated account of meetings and deadlines and professional responsibilities, and mentally cataloged every deception for the conversation that was coming. Tuesday brought a revelation that transformed my anger into strategic calculation. Lisa Martinez called with information that connected all the pieces of David and Amanda's deception in a way that revealed just how long they had been planning their future together. "Becca, I heard something at the women's Bible study that I think you should know," Lisa said, her voice carrying the careful tone people use when delivering news they know will be hurtful. Margaret Wilson mentioned that Amanda had asked her about the divorce laws in Ohio. I felt my breath catch. Divorce laws? Specifically about property division and custody arrangements when one spouse has significantly higher income than the other. Margaret thought it was academic curiosity, maybe a friend's situation, but given how close Amanda seems to be getting to your church community, the implications hit me like a physical blow. Amanda wasn't just having an affair with my husband. She was researching how to replace me legally, financially, and socially. She was gathering information about how much of David's income and assets she could expect to receive when their relationship moved from secret affair to open marriage. "Lisa, did Margaret mention anything else?" Amanda also asked about the church's position on remarriage after divorce, whether someone who had been married before could have a full church wedding, whether the congregation would accept a new wife who had been involved with a married man. Margaret said she gave very traditional answers, but Amanda seemed satisfied with the responses. Amanda Walsh wasn't just stealing my husband. She was planning to steal my entire life, my social circle, my church community, my financial security, my children's inheritance. She was conducting reconnaissance on how completely she could erase my existence and replace it with her own. That night, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable for the trusting wife I had been just weeks early. I was going to contact David's boss at Pinnacle Industries and share what I had discovered about my husband's unprofessional conduct with a junior employee. But first, I was going to give David one last chance to tell me the truth. Wednesday evening arrived with the weight of accumulated secrets pressing down on our dinner table like a storm system waiting to break. David was particularly animated, discussing the upcoming Guatemala mission with enthusiasm that I now recognized had nothing to do with charitable service and everything to do with extended time alone with Amanda. Emma and Tyler listened with the rapt attention children give to stories about faraway places, asking questions about languages and customs, and whether there would be exotic animals to see. "Will Miss Amanda be teaching the children Spanish while you're there?" Emma asked innocently, and I watched David's face light up in a way that confirmed my worst suspicions. Amanda has many talents, he said, cutting his chicken with careful precision while avoiding my gaze. She'll be coordinating educational supplies, but I'm sure she'll help with language practice too. She's very good with children. The casual way he spoke about Amanda's interaction with children made my stomach turn cold. This wasn't just about replacing me as a wife. David was already envisioning Amanda as a stepmother to Emma and Tyler, imagining a future where she would take my place in every aspect of our family life. "Daddy, will you bring us something special from Guatemala?" Tyler asked, his 8-year-old mind focused on the possibility of exotic souvenirs. "Of course, buddy. Maybe something Amanda helps me pick out. She has excellent taste in gifts." The comment was delivered with such casual intimacy that it revealed just how deeply integrated Amanda had become in David's thinking about our family. He wasn't just having an affair, he was mentally rehearsing life with his new partner, practicing how to introduce her influence into our children's lives. After dinner, while David retreated to his home office for another evening of project work that I knew involved lengthy phone conversations with Amanda, I made the phone call that would change everything. Robert Hayes answered his personal line on the second ring, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling business matters at all hours. I had met him several times at Pinnacle Industries functions, a distinguished man in his late 50s who took professional ethics seriously and expected the same standard from his employees. "Mr. Hayes, this is Rebecca Thompson, David Thompson's wife. I apologize for calling you at home, but I need to discuss a situation involving my husband and one of his subordinates that I believe requires your immediate attention." There was a pause that felt like an eternity before he responded. "Miss Thompson, I hope David isn't having health problems or family difficulties that might affect his work performance." "In a way, yes. Mr. Hayes, I have reason to believe that David is engaged in an inappropriate relationship with Amanda Walsh, a junior employee under his supervision. This relationship appears to be affecting both their professional judgment and potentially creating liability issues for Pinnacle Industries." Another pause, longer this time. When Mr. Hayes spoke again, his tone was carefully measured. "Mrs. Thompson, these are serious allegations. Do you have specific evidence to support your concerns? I have photographs of them together in situations that go far beyond appropriate professional interaction. I have documentation of extended lunches during work hours that appear to be romantic in nature, and I have reason to believe they are using company time and resources to coordinate personal activities, including a church missions trip that seems designed to provide them with unsupervised time together." "I see." Miss Hayes's voice had shifted into the mode I recognized from David's descriptions of difficult personnel situations. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that Pinnacle Industries has strict policies regarding workplace relationships, particularly those involving supervisory authority. If what you're suggesting is accurate, it represents a serious violation of company policy and professional ethics." "Mr. Hayes, I understand this puts you in a difficult position. David has been a valued employee, and I'm not approaching this lightly, but I believe you have a right to know when someone in a leadership position is potentially compromising the integrity of your organization. You're absolutely right to bring this to my attention. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow to discuss this situation in detail? I'd like to review any evidence you have and understand the full scope of the situation before determining appropriate action." We arranged to meet Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop near Pinnacle Industries, far enough from the office to ensure privacy but close enough to demonstrate the seriousness of the situation. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I had just lit a fuse that would eventually reach dynamite. David emerged from his office around 10 o'clock, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had spent the evening in conversation with the person who made him happiest. He kissed my forehead with the absent-minded affection of a man whose heart was elsewhere, then settled into his usual evening routine of checking email and preparing for the next day. "How was your evening?" I asked, testing his commitment to the lies that had become our new normal. Amanda and I finalized the educational supply list for Guatemala. She's really thought through every detail: pencils, notebooks, basic Spanish-English dictionaries. She cares so much about making a real difference in these children's lives. The way he spoke about Amanda's compassion, her attention to detail, her desire to help others, revealed just how completely he had rewritten their relationship narrative. In David's mind, Amanda wasn't his mistress, she was his partner in meaningful work, his companion in spiritual service, his equal in intelligence and values. He had transformed their affair into a love story that justified betraying his wife and children. "She sounds like a remarkable young woman," I said, choosing my words carefully. "You're fortunate to have such a dedicated colleague." "I am fortunate," David agreed, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was thinking about more than professional collaboration. "Sometimes you meet someone who changes your perspective on everything: work, service, what's possible in life. Amanda is that kind of person." I nodded as if I found this insight touching rather than devastating. "It's wonderful when professional relationships evolve into meaningful friendship." David's expression flickered with something that might have been guilt or calculation. "Yes, friendship. Though of course professional boundaries are important. We're always careful to maintain appropriate workplace conduct." The lies came so easily now that I wondered how long he had been practicing them, how many conversations we had shared where he was carefully editing reality to protect his secret. Every discussion about work, every explanation for late nights and weekend meetings, every casual mention of Amanda's name, all of it had been calculated. Deception designed to hide the most important relationship in his life. Thursday afternoon, I sat across from Mr. Hayes in a small coffee shop called The Grind, a place that catered to business professionals seeking quiet spaces for confidential conversation. He was exactly as I remembered, immaculately dressed, sharp-eyed and radiating the kind of competent authority that made Pinnacle Industries successful. I had prepared for this meeting like a lawyer preparing for trial, organizing photographs, receipts and timeline documentation that would paint an undeniable picture of David and Amanda's relationship. But I also understood that Miss Hayes's primary concern would be protecting his company from potential lawsuits, scandal, and the kind of workplace drama that could affect productivity and morale. "Miss Thompson," he began, settling into his chair with a cup of black coffee and a legal pad, "I want you to know that I take your concerns very seriously. Pinnacle Industries has built its reputation on professional integrity, and we cannot tolerate behavior that compromises that standard." I opened the folder I had prepared and placed the first photograph on the table between us. It showed David and Amanda embracing in the parking garage, their body language unmistakably romantic rather than professional. Mr. Hayes studied the image carefully, his expression growing more serious. "When was this taken?" "Monday of this week, during what David told me was a business lunch to discuss project deadlines." I placed the second photograph on the table, David and Amanda at the restaurant, leaning toward each other in intimate conversation while sharing dessert. This was taken approximately 30 minutes before the first photo. As you can see, they were engaged in behavior that goes well beyond appropriate colleague interaction. Mr. Hayes nodded grimly. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask some difficult questions. How long have you suspected this relationship?" "Several weeks, but I only began documenting it recently when I realized the scope of their deception." "Have they used company resources to facilitate their personal relationship?" "David has used work meetings as cover for romantic encounters. They've coordinated personal activities during business hours, and they're planning to use a church missions trip, which David justified to the company as team-building exercise, as an opportunity for extended time alone together." I placed the receipt from their lunch on the table, along with a printout of David's work calendar showing the meeting he was supposedly attending during their romantic interlude. "Miss Hayes, I believe Amanda has misrepresented her qualifications for church volunteer work, claiming international development experience that David may have helped her fabricate. If Pinnacle Industries has provided any support or endorsement for this missions trip, the company could face liability issues if her credentials are false." Mr. Hayes was taking notes now, his pen moving rapidly across the legal page. "Mrs. Thompson, you mentioned that Amanda is a subordinate employee, under David's supervision. Do you know if their relationship has affected personnel decisions, performance evaluations, or advancement opportunities?" "I don't have direct evidence of that, but Amanda has been included in high-level projects that seem beyond her experience level. She's also been given flexible scheduling and travel opportunities that other junior employees might not receive. Has David discussed Amanda's career prospects with you in ways that might suggest preferential treatment? He frequently mentions her exceptional performance and potential for advancement. He's also suggested that she deserves recognition and opportunities that will help her career development. Mr. Hayes set down his pen and looked at me directly. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to understand the seriousness of what you're reporting. If David is indeed involved in a romantic relationship with a subordinate employee, it violates multiple company policies. More importantly, it creates potential liability for sexual harassment claims, hostile work environment issues, and discrimination lawsuits from other employees who might feel they've been unfairly treated. I understand completely, Mr. Hayes. I'm not approaching this vindictively, but I believe you have a right to know when someone in a leadership position is compromising professional standards and potentially exposing your company to legal risks. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Thompson. I need to conduct a formal investigation into these allegations. This will involve interviewing David, Amanda, and potentially other employees who might have observed inappropriate conduct. I want you to know that we take retaliation seriously. If David attempts to blame you for this investigation, or creates difficulties in your personal life because of your report, that would constitute additional policy violations. What will happen to David's position at Pinnacle Industry? Mr. Hayes's expression was grim. If these allegations are substantiated, David will face immediate disciplinary action up to and including termination. A senior employee who engages in a romantic relationship with a subordinate violates our ethics code, our harassment policies, and our professional conduct standards. The fact that he has apparently used company time and resources to facilitate this relationship makes the situation even more serious. And Amanda's situation will depend on the extent of her participation and whether she can demonstrate that the relationship was consensual rather than coercive. However, junior employees who engage in relationships with supervisors also face disciplinary action, particularly if they've received preferential treatment or advancement opportunities as a result. I gathered the photographs and documents back into my folder, feeling like I had just activated a nuclear weapon that would destroy not only David and Amanda's relationship, but potentially their careers and reputations. Mr. Hayes, when will you begin the investigation? Tomorrow morning. I'll be calling David and Amanda into separate meetings to discuss these allegations. Mrs. Thompson, I want to prepare you for the possibility that David will realize you're the source of this investigation. Are you ready for that confrontation? I thought about Emma's innocent questions about Amanda's role in our family's future, about Tyler's excitement over souvenirs that David planned to choose with another woman's input, about the engagement ring that was currently hidden somewhere in our house, while David planned a future that didn't include me. Mr. Hayes, I've been ready for that confrontation since the moment I realized my husband was planning to replace me with his 28-year-old mistress. The only difference is that now I have evidence to support my accusations, and an ally who takes professional ethics seriously. That evening David came home with flowers again, white lilies this time, expensive and elegant and completely inappropriate for a man who was about to face professional ruin because of his inability to keep his personal life separate from his career. He presented them with the same flourish he had used for the roses, kissing my cheek with enthusiasm that felt performative rather than genuine. What's the occasion? I asked, accepting the flowers while mentally noting that this would likely be the last time he brought me gilt flowers. No occasion. I just realized how lucky I am to have a wife who supports my career and understands the demands of professional advancement. Amanda mentioned today how much she admires our marriage, how stable and secure it seems compared to the uncertainty of single life. The irony was so profound that I almost laughed. Amanda admired our marriage while actively working to destroy it, and David was grateful for my support while planning to abandon me for the woman who was helping him betray everything we had built together. How thoughtful of Amanda to notice our relationship, I said, arranging the lilies in a vase while wondering if this was the last normal conversation David and I would ever have. She's very perceptive about people. She said something today about how rare it is to find marriages that have stood the test of time, where both partners continue to grow and support each other's dreams. David was quoting Amanda's observations about our marriage like scripture, apparently oblivious to the cruel irony of praising his wife's devotion while planning to replace her with the woman providing the commentary. Either he was completely delusional about the situation, or he was engaging in psychological manipulation so sophisticated that it bordered on sociopathy. Amanda sounds like she has insights beyond her years, I said, testing whether David would recognize the bitter sarcasm in my tone. She does. Sometimes I think she understands relationship dynamics better than people twice her age. She has this way of seeing what really matters in life. I nodded as if I found this observation profound rather than nauseating. Well, I look forward to hearing more of her wisdom when she gets back from Guatemala. David's face lit up with anticipation that had nothing to do with charitable service. I think the missions trip will be life-changing for both of us. There's something about serving others together that deepens your understanding of what's really important. I'm sure it will be very meaningful, I agreed, knowing that by the time David was scheduled to leave for Guatemala, his relationship with Amanda would be the subject of a formal corporate investigation that would likely end both their careers. As I prepared for bed that night, listening to David's shower running while he hummed hymns and made phone calls that I assumed were to Amanda, I felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring consequences that had been building for weeks, revelations that would force everyone involved to face the truth about what they had been doing. But tonight, for the last time, I was married to a man who thought he was clever enough to maintain two relationships simultaneously, sophisticated enough to use our church community as cover for his affair, and charming enough to convince his wife that his increasingly obvious deceptions were signs of renewed devotion to our marriage. Tomorrow David Thompson would discover that underestimating his wife was the biggest mistake of his professional and personal life. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that comes before a storm breaks everything open. David left for work humming gospel songs, his cologne freshly applied and his confidence radiating the satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully orchestrated the perfect deception. He kissed me goodbye with theatrical affection, promised to be home early for family pizza night, and drove away in his silver sedan toward what he assumed would be another routine day at Pinnacle Industries. At 9:15 my phone rang. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Robert Hayes. The investigation has begun. David and Amanda have both been called into separate meetings this morning. I wanted you to know that the process is now official." I set down my coffee cup with hands that were surprisingly steady. "Thank you for keeping me informed. Miss Thompson, you should prepare yourself for David's reaction. When someone's career and reputation are threatened, they often lash out at the person they perceive as responsible for their exposure." By 11 o'clock my phone was buzzing with increasingly frantic text messages from Dave. The first few were confused, asking if I knew why he had been called into a meeting with Human Resources. Then came anger, demanding to know if I had said something to his colleagues about his work relationship. Finally came panic, begging me to call him back because he needed to explain something important before I heard it from someone else. I didn't respond to any of them. At noon, Lisa Martinez called with news that traveled through our church community faster than wildfire. "Becca, something's happened. Amanda Walsh called Pastor Coleman this morning to withdraw from the Guatemala missions trip. She said there had been a family emergency and she could no longer participate. But Margaret Wilson saw her at the bank this afternoon, and she looked like she'd been crying for hours." Did Pastor Coleman mention whether David was still planning to go? That's the strange part. David called about an hour after Amanda did, saying he was having second thoughts about the timing, something about work commitments that couldn't be postponed. The missions trip they had planned as their romantic getaway was collapsing along with their carefully constructed professional relationship. Whatever Miss Hayes had said to them during those separate meetings had made it clear that their affair was no longer a secret, and that continuing their association would only make their situations worse. Emma came home from school with innocent questions that cut deeper than she could possibly understand. "Mommy, is Daddy in trouble at work?" Tyler heard some ladies talking at the grocery store about someone from Daddy's office getting fired. "Sometimes adults make poor choices that affect their jobs," I said, pulling her close while wondering how much of this mess would eventually touch our children's lives. "But you don't need to worry about adult problems. Daddy and I will handle everything. David's car pulled into our driveway at 4 o'clock, hours earlier than his usual Friday schedule. Through the window I could see him sitting behind the wheel for several minutes, his head in his hands, gathering courage for the conversation he knew was coming. When he finally entered the house, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single day. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose world had collapsed without warning. "Becca, we need to Yes, we do." I sent Emma and Tyler to play in the backyard, then faced my husband in our living room where we had shared 12 years of marriage, 2 children's first steps, countless Christmas mornings, and thousands of ordinary moments that I now realized had been slowly dying while he built a new life with someone else. "You called my boss," he said, his voice flat with defeat rather than anger. "I reported a violation of professional ethics and company policy. You destroyed my career. You destroyed your career the moment you decided to have an affair with a subordinate employee." David collapsed onto our couch, his head in his hands again. "Becca, I know how this looks, but you don't understand the situation. Amanda and I never meant for this to happen. It just developed naturally, and we've been trying to handle it professionally. By lying to me for months, by using our church as cover for your relationship, by planning to spend 2 weeks in Guatemala together while I stayed home with our children. That's not how it was." "Then tell me how it was, David. Tell me about the engagement ring. Tell me about Amanda researching divorce laws. Tell me about all the times you came home smelling like her perfume after supposedly working late." David's composure finally cracked complete. Tears started flowing as he realized that his carefully maintained deception had been transparent for longer than he had imagined. "I love her," he whispered, and those 3 words contained more honesty than he had given me in months. "I know that hurts you and I'm sorry, but I can't help how I feel. Amanda makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years." "Then you should have divorced me before you started planning a future with her." "I wanted to protect the children. I wanted to find the right way to transition without destroying our family. By lying to everyone who trusted you, by making our children fall in love with a woman who was plotting to replace their mother. That was your idea of protection." David looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes that held the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. "Becca, is there any way we can work through this? Can we go to counseling, find a way to rebuild what we have?" I studied the face of the man I had loved for 12 years, the father of my children, the person I had trusted with my heart and my future. He was asking me to forgive adultery, deception, and a systematic plan to replace me with a younger woman. He was asking me to pretend that our marriage could survive his complete emotional transfer to someone else. "David, you already made your choice. You chose Amanda over our family every time you lied to me, every time you brought her into our church community, every time you planned activities that excluded me while including her. You don't get to unmake that choice just because the consequences turned out to be more serious than you expected." "What about Emma and Tyler? They'll survive their father's divorce better than they would survive growing up in a home where their mother accepted being second choice to their father's mistress." 3 hours later, David finished packing 2 suitcases and loading them into his car. Miss Hayes had placed him on immediate administrative leave pending the completion of their investigation, which meant he was unemployed with excellent chances of being terminated, and poor prospects for finding equivalent employment in our industry. Amanda had already submitted her resignation rather than face the disciplinary process, but her hasty departure wouldn't erase the documentation in her personnel file that would follow her to future job applications. As David prepared to leave our house for what we both knew would be the last time as my husband, he made one final attempt to rewrite the narrative of our relationship. "Becca, I want you to know that I never intended to hurt you. I thought I could manage the situation in a way that wouldn't damage our family. You managed it by bringing your mistress to church and introducing her to our children. You managed it by lying to me every day while planning to replace me. That wasn't management, Dave. That was cruelty disguised as consideration." 6 months later, I sit in the cafe bookstore I opened with my divorce settlement, watching regular customers who have become friends enjoy coffee and conversation in a space that belongs entirely to me. Emma and Tyler visit David every other weekend at the small apartment he shares with Amanda, who has found work at a non-profit organization that doesn't require references from Pinnacle Industries. David's plan to use our church community to facilitate his affair backfired more thoroughly than he could have imagined. When the truth about their relationship became public knowledge, several church families who had been impressed by Amanda's apparent devotion to missions work felt personally deceived by her performance. Pastor Coleman quietly suggested that they might be more comfortable worshiping elsewhere until the situation resolved itself. Grace Community Church still stands on the hill overlooking Riverside, Ohio, but the Thompson family no longer occupies the third pew from the front. Emma and Tyler have adapted to our new routine at a different church where their mother's reputation isn't shadowed by their father's scandal. Sometimes I think about the David I married 12 years ago, the man who seemed honest and devoted, and worthy of trust. But then I remember that the capacity for deception he demonstrated with Amanda didn't develop overnight. Looking back, I can see signs that he was always capable of compartmentalizing his life, always skilled at managing different relationships with different versions of himself. The difference is that now I choose truth over comfortable illusion, self-respect over false security, and authentic relationships over convenient arrangement. My husband brought his mistress to church, thinking he could use our faith community to normalize their affair and ease his transition from one family to another. Instead, he discovered that some betrayals are too profound to hide, and some communities have standards that can't be manipulated for personal convenience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.